talking starting today about stress recognition and reduction in shelter dogs, and then we're going to transition right into shelter cats. And really stress recognition is the most important thing you guys need to learn about because you know how stressful that shelter environment is. So what is stress really? What does this zebra think stress is? Well, the definition of stress: physical, mental, or emotional strain or tension in response to intense or prolonged aversive stimuli. Well, sounds like a shelter environment, yes? So when an animal is stressed, what happens is the stress response is triggered in the body. And the stress response is an adaptive mechanism, and this is what helps animals recover from stress. Okay? It is essential for survival, this whole thing that goes on within your body when you get stressed. For one thing, the sympathetic nervous system kicks in and does things that are associated with the flight or fight response. When you're in a scary, stressful environment, your body has to react. And so things that are happening physiologically to your body, your heart rate increases, your cardiac output increases, your vasodilation to your vital organs increase, your respiratory rate increases, and there's really no need for these other things here when you're just trying to survive. And so this all happens in the split second to prepare yourself for action when you are in a stressful or fearful situation. And lots of stuff goes on in your body when this is happening. So we get a release of neurotransmitters, epinephrine and norepinephrine, as well as the stress hormone cortisol. And all this stuff happens in the split second. And so the timeline of the stages of the stress response, the first stage is called the stage of alarm. And during that stage, that's when the body recognizes that there's something stressful. And so that's the state of alarm. And then what happens if that stressor continues, then the body has to cope with that stressor. So that stage is called resistance, and that's the stage when we're trying to do things to help us cope with that stressor. We're trying to get away from it, we're trying to hide from it, whatever the case may be. But there comes a point in the third stage of the stress response that we are exhausted. Everything in our body starts getting depleted, and we can't deal with it anymore, because the stress response is meant to happen very quickly and get you over some acute stress. So it's the chronic stress that's the problem. And this is why it's so critically important that we recognize stress early and implement stress reduction procedures in the shelter, because these animals are there long term. And you know, if you are driving down the road and you almost get in a car accident, and all that stuff happens to you in that split second, and then it brings you back to homeostasis, back to normal, and you're like, whew, that was close. Well, now we have animals that are in the shelter, and they're there day after day after day in this stressful environment. And so they're going to hit that stage of exhaustion pretty quickly, and everything's going to start being depleted. So it's really our jobs from day one, from the moment those animals walk into that shelter, to consider their stress level and do everything that we can to reduce that stress level. Because when animals are in unnatural environments, like a zoo, or a laboratory, or an animal shelter, and I've worked in all three of these situations, and they're all stressful. And when animals are in this stressful situation, their welfare is absolutely a concern. So shelters really do need to put a priority on stress reduction programs. It's really important to take care of their psychological well-being, because keeping them behaviorally healthy is just as important as keeping them medically healthy. And they are also intertwined. It is also the humane thing to do. So this is our goal when we take in animals, to be humane and to care for them both mentally and physically. So recognizing and reducing stress is really the most critical part of any wellness program in your shelter. So that's why I start with it when I have a list of talks to give, because it is the most important thing, and the thing we need to do from the moment they walk into the shelter. Because stress reduces welfare, it increases susceptibility to illness. As those things start depleting in the body can't fight illness anymore. And that's why animals get so sick in the shelter. In addition to being around lots of other animals that might be sick, their immune system is compromised because of the stress they're under. And then we have potential for increase in development of behavior problems. And behavior problems are the number one reason why animals are surrendered to the shelter, But we also know that the stressful environment of the shelter creates more behavior problems. And so we really, really need to address this. It's a serious business. So why is the shelter such a stressful place? These are some of the reasons why the shelter is stressful to the animal. They've been abandoned, they're in a novel environment, they're in confinement, they're isolated, very high noise levels, they're not sleeping really well, the sight, sounds, and smells of other animals, they're confused, they're frustrated, they're being handled by strangers. And the big one is that they don't have any control over their environment. If you're in a stressful situation but you can control it, then you're going to be able to get through it okay. But they can't control it. They want out of that cage and they can't get out of that cage. And so lack of control is a huge stressor in any captive environment, whether it's a zoo, a laboratory, or an animal shelter. Now, there are individual differences in terms of how animals deal with stress, both in and out of the shelter. Lots of individual differences that we see. It can vary based on their breed, their species, their neuter status, their age, their experiences. Everything that they've gone through, everything about that animal will affect whether they can cope with this stress of the shelter. You all know some animals come in and are like, this is pretty cool. And other animals, most animals, are pretty stressed out. Some animals recover from that pretty quickly, and some never do. So it's all individual differences. Just like if I told you guys, okay, I'm going to just randomly pick one of you to finish my talk because I'm not feeling well. I might pick someone and say, cool, I got my chance. And I might pick somebody who would faint, right? So that's the same thing in the animal shelter. All right, so things that affect the coping skills of animals. Number one, their genetic makeup. So again, just like humans, some of us cope with things better than others. And their genetic makeup plays a role. But life experiences play a role as well. Whether the animal was socialized. So if the animal wasn't socialized to humans and now he's in a cage being taken care of by strange humans, that's going to be pretty stressful. So socialization is important. And if something bad happens to that animal during its time of socialization, let's say it has a negative experience with someone, then they're going to be more frightened by these strangers coming up and trying to care for them in the cage. Again, any kind of learned experiences and habituation to the stressor. Do you think that the shelter is more stressful for a dog who's never been kenneled in his life compared to a dog whose owners went on vacation twice a year and stuck him in a kennel for a week? So sometimes that has an effect as well. But regardless of the individual differences in coping, we know that the first few days in any shelter is stressful for the animals. One study by Hennessy et al. Showed that dogs' cortisol level goes up when they first come in, stays high for about 3 days, and then starts coming down. So that cortisol level is that stress hormone. And so what we know is that all animals show this increase in cortisol when they come into the shelter. And another study looked at this. They habituated half of the dogs to the kennel environment before putting them into a shelter, and the other half were not. And they all had raised cortisol levels, even though the ones that were not habituated had higher than the habituated ones. But they still all had higher cortisol levels. And I like this quote that came from another paper. It's not the physical characteristic of an aversive stimuli, but rather the cognitive appraisal of that stimulus, which determines its aversive character and whether a state commonly described as stress is induced. So it's really not about if it's what you perceive, it's what the animal perceives. So if I see a spider and I get stressed, and you love spiders, you have a collection of them, like, why are you so stressed about the spider? It's my perception of that spider is causing my stress. So it's the individual's perception is what matters. Now, when we talk about stress, we want to know how are animals sensing the world, because animals sense the world differently than we do, and we take in everything about our environment through our senses. So when we look at the auditory sense, dogs hear in a range that humans do not hear. So we hear up to 20 kilohertz. A dog can hear up to 60 kilohertz. What that means is that dogs are hearing things in the shelter that you can't hear. If we can't perceive it, we don't know it's stressing the dog out. Okay, so you always, and we can't do anything about that. We can't, make our hearing better. But if we understand that they might be perceiving things that we can't hear. Okay, then that's important. Like, we can't hear the hum of the fluorescent lights unless we're really, really quiet. Well, maybe for the dog it's really loud. Their olfactory sense, of course, is amazing. So humans have 5 million scent receptors, which sounds like a lot till you compare it to a dog. A dog has 220 million scent receptors. Scent is so important to them. So that means that that shelter and all the scents that are going on in there have an effect on that dog, way more than they do with us. And of course, dogs also, their vision is different than ours. And so if you look at these diagrams, I don't have a pointer. I told Dave I didn't need one, and here, oh, he has one somewhere for me. But anyway, here we go. I'll forget it. The top one, you see that the lighter shaded area is the dog's peripheral vision, and the darker is the dog's binocular vision, compared to humans, where the dark is the binocular vision, and that's our little peripheral vision. So our vision is much different. And without that binocular vision, dogs have really poor depth perception and poor close-up vision. So they're seeing things differently than we see things. So all that stuff is important. And of course, I know this is a picture of a cat, but cats and dogs have a vomeronasal organ whose only purpose is to take in and analyze pheromones. Okay? And pheromones are chemical messages that are emitted out of specialized glands, and they're species-specific chemicals. And so dogs emit dog pheromones that only dogs smell or detect. Okay? When a cat does a flamen response, that's the cat taking that pheromone up into their vomeronasal organ. You've probably all seen cats do that. Dogs don't do a flamen response. They do a behavior we call tonguing, where they kind of flick their tongue a little bit and push that pheromone up into their vomeronasal organ, the opening of which is behind the incisor teeth. So pheromones are also very important. So animals react to stimuli because of what they take in from their senses, just like we do. So because of their sensitive hearing, that shelter's a very loud place at times, especially early morning cleaning. Because of their incredible sense of smell, the odors of the cleaning agents we use could be very, very irritating to them, especially if you're not mixing your bleach in the right dilution. Because of their different vision, they might be responding to things differently than we would expect them to, our movements and such. And because of their vomeronasal organ, they could be detecting the fear pheromones of their conspecifics. And so that is another thing we don't think about because we have no perception of these things. So whether a dog is captured as a stray or he's abandoned by his owner, going into this novel environment of a shelter is stressful for all of them. So stressors for the captive dog. Being handled by strangers is stressful. Diet change is stressful. You don't think about that as a stressor. You know, maybe they're getting better food than they were getting in their previous home, better quality food, but it's still a change. Routine changes. For dogs, this is a big one too, especially a really house-trained dog who wants to go out, and now they have no control over that because they're in the cage and they're forced to eliminate in their cage. That's a big stressor for dogs. The noise levels in the shelter. Now I told you how intense their sense of hearing is. It's really loud in the shelter. So let's look at some noise levels in the shelter. They can exceed 118.9 decibels in one paper that recorded this. Now, if you don't know what a decibel is and how loud that might be, anything over 70 decibels is considered loud. 96 decibels is a subway train when you're down there in the subway with it. 110 decibels is a jackhammer, if you're doing the jackhammer. And 120 is a propeller aircraft. So any sound that's between 90 and 120 is considered that critical zone where you can feel it as well as hear it. I think OSHA regulation for ear protection is 90, I think. So, and a lot of shelter kennels exceed 100 decibels when the dogs are all barking. That's loud. We have dogs that suffer from sleep deprivation because of the noise, because of the stress, because a lot of times it never truly gets dark in the shelter. I consult with shelters all over, and I can't tell you how many times I go in, and the lights really never go off. There's emergency lighting, and there's fire code lighting, and the animals never really get complete darkness. And we know we need darkness to sleep, because when it gets dark, our melatonin goes up, and then we go to sleep. This is really important stuff. But when an animal is exposed to light all the time and they don't get their darkness, they're not sleeping well. The odors of the shelter. So again, if your kennel's next to the cleaning room with all those cleaning agents, then that's going to be really stressful and very irritating. The events that happen at the shelter, you know, we have to clean the shelter. We have hoses, we have things that make noise, and these things can be really scary and stressful for the dogs. Lack of exercise. So a lot of shelters don't take their dogs for walks, and they live in these little teeny tiny cages until they get adopted. And so not enough exercise. Social stress. So sometimes dogs are housed next to each other with no visual barriers, and that's really hard. That's some pretty serious social stress when you constantly have to look at your neighbor, and maybe you don't like your neighbor, or maybe your neighbor's intimidating you. There are some shelters, luckily not too many up here in the Northeast, where there's 20 dogs in one pen. Talk about stress. That's a very stressful environment for those dogs. Conversely, we have the loneliness factor. Dogs are social animals. They need social companionship. So when they are alone in a cage day after day, week after week, month after month, then they're going to suffer because of that loneliness. Dogs are also dealing with conflict all the time in the shelter. They might be afraid of the person, yet they're dependent on that person. That person lets them out, that person gives them food, yet it's someone that they're really nervous about. They're afraid to exit the cage, but they really want to get out of the cage. So they have these mixed emotions, and that conflict adds to the stress. They're frustrated. They're frustrated because it's a restricted environment, because they don't have any control, and because they're behind barriers. And barrier frustration is a really bad problem in shelter dogs. They're frustrated because they can't get out. Again, barrier frustration. They're frustrated because they see others go out first. They're frustrated because other dogs pass them by all day long. They're frustrated because people pass them by all day long. So frustration is a big thing for shelter dogs, because as a social animal, dogs are compelled to greet other social animals. And when they're prevented from doing that, they become frustrated. You know what frustration is and how it feels. And this frustration sometimes leads to reactive barking and lunging, and this can escalate as the dog is in the shelter longer and longer. And so you've all seen this barrier frustration develop and get worse as time goes on, as this dog practices his behavior over and over again. So some other effects of stress and captivity, we see lethargy and depression in some dogs. Other dogs, we see hyperactivity. So maybe you think, oh, this dog is just untrained and out of control. Well, it just could be his way of manifesting what's the stress he's feeling, that he doesn't know what else to do but act a little crazy. Fear aggression, barrier aggression. So when a dog is showing barrier frustration day after day after day, sometimes it just keeps escalating. He's so darn frustrated. And then they start feeling angry. And so then that anger brings on this barrier aggression. And so we see rah, 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 rah at the cage front, and all of a sudden turns into this after 3 or 4 weeks. So this is why it's important to get on top of this stuff early. Redirected aggression, if you're co-housing your dogs, so you've probably seen redirected aggression. 2 dogs come in, they were very lovely together, they lived in a home together, now they're in a cage together, but now they've been barking at dogs go by every day, and now their frustration is building and building and building, and pretty soon they start attacking each other. And it's just the frustration buildup. And some severe manifestations of stress are stereotypic behaviors. And stereotypic behaviors develop when there's no escape. The animal feels like there's no escape from some kind of fearful stimuli. And thwarted attempts to engage in important behaviors can also bring on displays of stereotypies. There is a genetic influence. Not all animals develop stereotypic behavior in a captive environment. It's one of the things I looked at with my master's research with primates. There is a genetic component to it. But we see several different kinds of stereotypies in a shelter. We can see self-mutilation in the form of acral lick granuloma. Now sometimes, of course, there could be an underlying medical problem with this that's triggered it, but could also be triggered just by stress. We see rhythmic vocalization. We see biting of the cage, repetitive stereotypic biting of the cage. And in the new glassed room shelters, we see repetitive licking or biting of the glass. Anybody seen this? Yes? Not real pleasant for the adopters to see. And we see stereotypic jumping and pacing and circling. And so here's a dog who's stereotypically bouncing off the wall. And so this dog is now probably going to be doing this all day long because it's a stereotypy. The stereotypy, look how it's the same motion every single time. Here's a dog who's stereotypically spinning. And sometimes this is because they were housed long term, and sometimes a dog can do this after one day. It's about their genetic makeup and how they're coping with this stress. Here's a guy who just jumps all day long. And this is why you have to have some cages with tops on them for some of these guys. Okay. And then here's another one who just circles all day long. And in my travels across the country to shelters, I see dogs that are showing this behavior. We're lucky we don't see it in every dog. It is a small percentage of dogs that have this genetic propensity, but it's serious and it's very disturbing. So we want to reduce stress in our shelter dogs as soon as we can and as well as we can, because again, we don't want to get them to the exhaustion phase of the stress response. We don't want them to get sick, and we don't want their behaviors to develop into more serious behaviors. So first thing we want to think about is a comfortable environment. Okay? Giving them something soft to lay on, giving them a raised bed, that's really a pretty easy thing to do, giving them a comfortable environment instead of letting them sleep on the concrete. This is when I was at the ASPCA as their behaviorist. And so here's the adoption floor. Yeah, it's a little over the top, but that dog's pretty darn happy, don't you think? Now, some people say, oh, you really put chairs in the kennels? We did put chairs in the kennels. They were covered by like 5 quilts. And I'll tell you, very rarely did they urinate on them. You never put an unneutered male dog in there. But they love their chairs. Now, people say, well, I don't want my dog to sit on the furniture. Well, that's okay. You can teach them not to sit on the furniture when you get them home. But a nice, comfortable environment is a really nice thing to do. Quiet kennels. Quiet kennels reduces the arousal level, which reduces stress. And so getting your kennel to be quieter is really important. Now, how many have heard of the Click for Quiet program? Do you do it at your shelter? Okay. How many have never heard of Click for Quiet? You don't know what I'm talking about. Okay. Everyone know what clicker training is? So clicker training is just a marker-based training system where the click means you just earned a reward. The Click for Quiet program, I don't have a video of it, but the Click for Quiet program is just simply every day, several times a day, the staff and volunteers walk the kennel, and they just go up to a cage, and if a dog is quiet, they just click and treat. And if he's barking, they go past him. And you do this every single day, and pretty soon more and more dogs are on board, and pretty soon, instead of everyone getting crazy, riled up barking, when people come in, they all get quiet. Now you got to do it every day because you have new dogs coming in every day. But it's a really effective program. I'd be glad to talk to you about it more afterwards. Reminder signs, if you have a particular dog that has a barker, you put a reminder sign for everybody to make sure that they click when he's quiet. Okay? Visual barriers can be very helpful. So if you have a dog, dogs that are highly aroused in their kennels every time another dog goes by, this is a shelter over here. This is a shelter I work with in Idaho, and they have this long, thin kennel building, and in the morning it was just out of control, and I'm sure a lot of you guys experience the same thing. They walk the dog down the galley there, and every dog goes crazy. So I said, you know what, I want you to get some shower curtains. These are shower curtains. And just string up the shower, just put a string up, put some shower curtains, and now they close all the shower curtains and just one by one bring the dogs out, and their arousal level has gone way, way, way down. It's simple, it's cheap, and it's very, very effective. So visual barriers can be very helpful as well. So there's also some soothing music out there that can be helpful to help calm and quiet the dogs. The first one that came out that I started using was called the Canine Lullabies CD. And this is lullabies, but the underlying beat is heartbeat. The work comes from what they were doing with newborn or premature babies in hospitals, playing this music with a heartbeat as the underlying beat. And it really does the same thing with dogs. This is afternoon at the Chemung shelter. Open hours. So give Chemung a hand. Okay? So the CD can be very, very helpful, and they played the CD in the afternoon. There's another CD I like actually even better, and if you haven't heard of this one, it's called Through a Dog's Ear. And it's what they call psychoacoustically designed music. They actually design the music to take out any tones or anything that have any kind of irritating effect on the nervous system. And it's really nice music, and I use it not just for dogs, but for cats and for me. I love it. I put it on, I'm very relaxed. But the research they did for Through the Dog's Ear was done at shelters. So here's a little example of this shelter. Okay? So it can be very effective. Now, you're not going to just play that and everything's going to be great like the CD shows, but you combine some of these things, the Click for Calm program, and play your calming music in the afternoon or whenever. It's really very effective. Social contact is also really important, of course, with dogs. Sitting with them quietly, brushing them, petting them. Dogs are social animals. We need to give them that social contact in the shelter environment so A, is a stress reliever, B, to keep them socialized to humans. And so all these things that can be very helpful. Do nothing time is really important, because I always say to shelter people, they have lovely, wonderful volunteers that come in and walk the dogs, and some dogs get walked like 3 hours a day, and they come back and they're like, they're getting great, good exercise, but what do most people want with their pet dog? They want to come home from work, sit down, have a drink, read the paper, and have their dog at their feet. And the dog's been alone all day. We got to help these dogs learn that when you're with people, sometimes it's about being quiet. It's not always about running around and getting a walk. Not to say those things aren't important, they absolutely are. But some nice, quiet, do-nothing time is great for the shelter dogs. Massage can be great. Just like massage helps us relax, massage helps all other animals relax as well. And so giving a dog a massage, when I was at the MSPCA, this is Tracy, and Tracy is a massage therapist who came in every Tuesday and massaged every dog on the adoption floor. And so here's our nice, hyper, barky, crazy pit bull, and look at her eating that up. Okay? So you don't need to be a massage therapist to give a dog a massage. Massage is very stress relieving. And calm interactions at the cage front are also important, because again, when people go up to the cage front, it's usually an arousing situation. Oh, you're going to give me food, you're going to take me out on a walk. But just sitting in front of the cage and just talking to the dog and teaching them to be calm when there are people in front of your run, that can be very helpful as well. Getting them a little bit of time outside of their cage, in an office or a real life room. When I was at the MSPCA, this was my real life room where I did my behavioral evals, but in all afternoon we just rotated the dogs in there. I was very lucky to have that lovely room. But you can just rotate dogs into your office. We also did that. This is the back office dog. And so every day a different dog got to sit in the back office, and a lot of shelters do this, I've seen it. But just giving the dogs a little time away from the kennel is really very helpful. Now, predictable schedules are really helpful to reduce stress, because if they can predict it, it really does help them. So predictable schedules for feeding, for walking, for playing, for training, for enrichment is key. So try to keep things on a schedule. Dogs and cats like routine, just like most humans like routine. Exercise is important. Okay? Exercise, just like in humans, can absolutely counteract the effects of stress. And we want to give them aerobic exercise. So running, you know, if you don't want to go jogging with them, take them out in a yard and throw a ball or whatever you can do, give them some aerobic exercise. And pheromone therapy. So now the DAP stands for dog appeasing pheromone. And the pheromone is the pheromone of a nursing mother dog. It's what she emits out of specialized glands along her mammary chain when her puppies are nursing. And they've synthesized that pheromone and put it in this product. And it can be very helpful. It's hard to use this stuff at a shelter. It's very expensive, and you have to ask for donations. But it can be very helpful. I find that the collars work really nicely on the dogs that are really stressed. The collar lasts about 30 days. You can either switch it to a new dog if it gets adopted or adopt the dog with the collar on. Or the spray. You can spray a little bandana and put the bandana on the dog if he's particularly stressed. The diffuser doesn't work real well in kennel environment just because it's probably too big of a room and the guillotine doors are open a lot. So DAP can be very helpful. I use it a lot in my own practice, but most shelters can't afford it. So I always tell shelters, you know, ask for donations of this stuff. I've even suggested they buy some, put it in the lobby and say, for sale for the shelter dog. So people just pay for it and hand it right back to you. And so that's a nice way because people come in all the time, what can I do for the dogs? Okay. And how many of you have heard of the Thundershirt? Oh, everybody's heard of the Thundershirt. How many of you ever used it in a kennel, in a shelter environment? Okay, do you find that it helps? Okay, the Thundershirts can be very helpful for anything. They're called Thundershirts, but they're used for any kind of stress-related issue. And they can be helpful in the shelter dogs. And so if you have a particularly stressed dog, you can ask for a donation. You can go to Walmart or wherever and buy a little tight T-shirt even. And we've done that, you know. So you can just put a tight T-shirt on them.
The Thundershirt company has a really nice program where they will give you Thundershirts. You just have to go.
For shelters?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Fill out some information on their website and they get them to you.
Excellent.
Sometimes there's some lag time, but they will get them.
And that said, the Through a Dog's Ear also has a shelter program. If you get on the Through a Dog's Ear website and you go under shelter program, and they will send you a free CD. Okay, so everybody should get their free CD from Through a Dog's Ear too. But thanks for letting us know, Lori, about the Thundershirt. I didn't know they were doing that. That's great. Okay, so our list for stress reduction in shelter dogs: comfortable environment, soothing music, quiet kennels, time outside of the kennel, social contact, predictable schedules, some aerobic exercise, and perhaps some of these other newer things that cost a little money, or maybe you can get donations, the DAP or the Thundershirt. Okay, so I did end a little early. I'm going to go right into the cat thing unless there's questions on dog stress reduction.